I'm Mike Mercer, and I want to welcome you to the Empower You America podcast. Our guest this evening is Joel Gunz, and Joel is a world expert on the films of Alfred Hitchcock. So we're going to be discussing Hitch's approach to filmmaking, and then we're going to walk through and discuss two iconic Hitchcock films, The Birds and North by Northwest. So we're going to begin our interview with Joel after just a few brief announcements. First, I want to tell you that Empower You is a free university, and this is our 27th semester. Our motto is educate, enjoy, engage. And our goal is to educate you to empower you in your lives. So this is a free speech zone, and we highly value free speech. So anyone is welcome to make any comments. If you have any questions or comments, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We rely on financial support, and we have expenses like production, advertising, and staffing. So if you want, you can donate two ways. One, you can click on the donate button anytime you sign up for, fill out the form to sign up for a class, or you can go to empoweryouamerica.org and hit the donate button on the right-hand side. For this semester, we're offering a podcast version of Empower You every Tuesday. And we're also offering the opportunity to advertise on the podcast. And if you want to get information about advertising rates, you can go to the homepage, empoweryouamerica.org, and look at the right-hand side. If you're interested in advertising, you can email us at info@empoweryouamerica.org. Every week's every class at Empower You is archived, so whether it's the podcast we're doing, which is just virtual, or on Tuesdays, or the in-studio class, which is also live streamed, we're going to be, we record those and post the video to our website, to a Rumble channel. And then what we're doing with the podcast is stripping out the audio and posting it so far to Spotify and Spreaker. And we've applied to be accepted into the iHeart podcast platform, and we're also going to be posting to iTunes probably in the next week. Every week we try to recommend some required reading, and this week I want to recommend Truffaut and Hitchcock, which is a book that was written by Francois Truffaut, the French director and film critic, and Joel is going to be discussing that book, so I don't want to say too much about it. But it was published in 1966, and it was based upon a series of interviews Truffaut did with Hitchcock. And I want to read a quote from a New York Times review about this book. So the book was republished in an edited version in the mid-'80s, and the New York Times reviewer said, "One is ravished by the density of insights into cinematic questions. Truffaut performed a tour de force of fact in getting this ordinarily guarded man to open up as he had never done before and never would again." So it's considered to be like a profoundly insightful book into the ideas and filmmaking of Alfred Hitchcock. So, and then finally, we have, I want to mention our two next Empower You classes. On February 29th, Peter Bronson will be returning to Empower You to discuss his new book, The Man Who Saved Cincinnati. And then next Tuesday, on March 5th, we'll invite Bill Gladwell back to return to Empower You. And he's a speaker, author, and consultant, and he'll be talking about 10 essential life skills. You can view all of our classes at empoweryouamerica.org. Now I would like to welcome Joel. Joel is an award-winning filmmaker and a Hitchcock expert. And he has a lot of initiatives going on related to Hitchcock and film. So he's the president of MacGuffin Media. And with MacGuffin Media, he brings together movie lovers of all ages for online movie nights. He streams educational films. And he also reads from a journal, which is called the Hitchcockian Quarterly, which is also published and edited by Joel. Is that correct, Joel?
Yep.
He's the president and founder of HitchCon, which is the world's largest annual conference dedicated to the artistry of Alfred Hitchcock, and that's in its fourth year. Joel is the author of hundreds of scholarly articles, chapters, essays. His film Spellbound by Lamore Fu won the best short documentary at the Medusa Film Festival. And he's also produced and directed 3 film essay series. So, Joel, welcome to Empower You. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that lovely introduction as well. I sound busy.
You must be. And you're living a life of passion. I mean, how did you initially get involved with
I got into it for the money. No, it started, I think, with most people who become Alfred Hitchcock geeks, Alfred Hitchcock nerds. It started right around the turn of puberty. And in my case, I was about 12 years old, and I was raised in a good Christian family, Jehovah's Witnesses. And when you turn 12, your mind starts turning to dark matters, especially if you're a little boy. Um, I wasn't allowed to watch John Carpenter films because they were rated R. I couldn't listen to heavy metals, so there was no chance of me becoming a knight in Satan's service. And so my options were limited, right? And but for some reason, my parents at that age decided that maybe it would be okay to watch Hitchcock movies because they're tamer and they had some thrills and chills in them. And actually, what got it started, like the initial point, and I will never forget this moment. I asked my stepdad. I'd heard of Alfred Hitchcock. I didn't really know anything about him, and I said, "Who is this guy?" And he said that he was this film director who had this ability to manipulate people's minds and the way they think and feel just by the way he edited his films together. And that just absolutely caught my imagination. And that just sounded like magic to me. And it still sounds like magic to me. And that got me started. And in fact, it took a while to see his movies. So I just started my first exposure to him was a documentary that was running on PBS at the time. And it was an interview with him in which he explains his techniques. So he would describe, how do you build suspense? How do you do this? How do you do that? And then they would cut away to an example from one of his films demonstrating the technique that he was describing. So before I saw any of his movies, I had already seen the crop duster scene from North by Northwest, the murder in the shower from Psycho. Basically, this documentary ruined Hitchcock for me because I saw all the highlights out of context. And then still hadn't seen his movies, but that, as happened on PBS at the time, if something came on that was popular, it would probably come on again in a few weeks. So I saw that documentary over and over again. I made an audio cassette recording of it that I played over and over again. In fact, right at that time, we were at a garage sale and his biography had just come out and somebody had dropped it off at this garage sale. Hitch, The Life and Times of Alfred Hitchcock. This is the authorized biography that he participated in. And I committed this book to memory, and I still hadn't seen any of his actual films. So I came into it completely from a, kind of an abstract, you could say intellectual approach, not as a fan. And finally, some months went by, and again, this is the '80s, so it's not like I could just go get a DVD or stream it. Finally, the movie Rebecca came. I think it came on TV, and that was my first Alfred Hitchcock movie. And I fell in love with Joan Fontaine. I got freaked out by Mrs. Danvers, and then we were off and running.
Now, do you have a personal favorite? I mean, I assume you've seen every Hitchcock film, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You've studied them all. So do you have a favorite?
Yeah.
Do you want to
in slow motion, backwards and forwards?
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but lately, last few years, I think Marnie is probably it's not only my favorite, but I think it's his true masterpiece. It's a very divisive film. People either love it or they hate it. Vertigo is much more famous. It's the one that stayed at the top of the Sight and Sound poll for, a couple of go-arounds. But this is the Marty, I think, is the one that really is his masterpiece. Well, they're both masterpieces, but this is his crowning achievement, I think.
Yeah. If before we want to dig into your, and learn from you about his approach to filmmaking. But before we do, I'm wondering, do you have some summary viewpoint about his place in film history?
He's let's put it this way. He is to cinema what Shakespeare is to theater and drama. So there are many playwrights that are genius, that have pushed the art forward, but there's only one Shakespeare, and everything kind of like all roads lead back to Shakespeare, if you're going to be a playwright. And Hitchcock is the same way. There are so many giants out there, so many geniuses, but I think 400 years from now, people will still be going back to Hitchcock movies and learning from them and talking about them and just like watching them.
Well, what would you say? Is there like a legacy that he's left? If you were to say like this is what he gave to filmmaking. What if you can, reduce it to some 1 to 3 concepts? What would that be? What would that contribution be?
Well, first of all, he directed 54 movies from the silent period all the way up into the 70s. And so his work just spans the whole history of film, into its maturity. But I think it could be somewhat inadvertent. But the book that you mentioned at the outset, Hitchcock Truffaut, this was the first, I believe, book-length interview with any director. And in that book, he lays out all of his theory about how cinema language works. And you can read that book like a cookbook if you're a filmmaker to get your ideas. In fact, you talk to any filmmaker and they'll say, yeah, I learned how to make movies from that book. And so this is a document that all he did was sit down and talk. He didn't necessarily create it, but that might be the one thing that has secured him in the annals of history. Because then once that happened, then everybody starts piling on and they start noticing him. And then the writing piles up on top of the writing and the thinking piles on top of the thinking. And now you've got a whole body. I've got a whole library, bookshelves full of stuff that I can't even keep up with because so many people are thinking and writing about his work, but it goes back to that one book.
So if we were to look at how old was Hitchcock when he first got into the film business?
So he was 19 or 20.
19 or 20.
And so he was a young guy. And, okay. He's in London and he'd been knocking around. He left school at 15 to go work to help support the family. And that was unusual for the time. So, but he didn't complete a high school, track, and he didn't go to college.
Wow.
But, he already showed aptitude and interest in engineering. Then he took art classes. Well, if you combine engineering with art and you live in the neighborhood in London that's adjacent to the big movie studios that are there's a good chance that you're going to fall into the film industry. And that's what he did.
How did he initially break into the film business? What were his first jobs? He wasn't a director initially, I assume.
Right. Yeah. No. So he very much reminds me of what we see in the gaming community today, that film in the 19-teens, 1920s was viewed dismissively in the same way that gaming is viewed dismissively by many people today. It's not real art. It's not real literature, whatever. Whereas people who are really into it will tell you, no, that it's as significant as these other forms. And so because film lived in this space that Philip K. Dick described as the trash stratum, it was a disrespected part of the arts community. That's where genius can thrive because nobody's expecting it, and there's elbow room to experiment, right? So he's a kid. He's 16, 17, 18 years old. He is going to see every movie that's come out in his neighborhood. Then he's walking across the street to see plays, and because he lives, adjacent to the film industry, he sees all these actors that are performing in plays on Friday night. Then he might go to see the film version of that play the very next night, and he'll see the same actors because that's how it worked. And then after the movie's over, after the play is over, then he'll go grab a pint of beer at the local pub, and he'll see these actors now out of character, hanging out and drinking. And so that's a very specific and unique milieu to be in. So he's a teenager and he wants to get into the film industry, but he doesn't know how. So he's hanging out in magazine shops. And instead of reading film fan magazines, puff pieces, he's going straight to the trade publications. And he's reading about lighting and camera operation and how cameras are made. And he's reading advertisements for the latest technology. And that's how he's absorbing it. So he knocks around, he goes to school a little bit. He does gets a job at a telegraph company where he ends up in the ad department, and he's a creative. So he's making ads that are funny and entertaining as a kid. He's writing short stories that, if you read these short stories he wrote at age 19, these are everything that is in his films for the next half century are all packed in there. That's the seed. That's the nucleus that everything kind of exploded out of. So finally, he gets a job at Famous Players Lasky. He's, like I said, around 19, 20 years old. And he's willing to do anything, scrub the floors. And but his first job is, because he has some graphic design work, he's designing title cards and, the dialogue cards that go into silent movies to tell you what the characters are saying. And immediately, right out of the gate, he's innovating. So he doesn't just design title cards, and that's not enough for him. Instead, he also includes a little spot art and little graphic descriptors that sort of enhance the meaning of the dialogue that's being created. So in one scene, the card says that that our hero is busy working all the time, and so he included a little picture of a candle burning at both ends. And that kind of conceptual thinking, was novel, and it also got him noticed. So from there, then he moved right into into art direction and production design. And a lot of that, is design work, and it's very fun and creative. It's also involves a hammer and nails and getting dirty.
So you mentioned that he had taken art classes and he could draw, and he started off sort of, what was it, writing the cards or something?
Yeah.
What were the cards he was writing initially?
They're the dialogue title cards for silent movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that ability to draw and to think visually, that actually became a major component of his filmmaking, didn't it? In terms of, the storyboarding. I was wondering if you'd tell us about the storyboarding approach that he took.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So he learned how to draw early on, as a teenager. He took those art classes, and but initially it was just an interest for him. He wasn't necessarily taking that anywhere per se, but it came out two ways. So it sort of inculcated in him a very visual way of thinking about the frame. So he could draw on, he could just sketch a scene out for a cameraman to shoot just on the spot, for sure. But more importantly, it gave him a visual perspective. So if he was reading a script that had no visuals, or he was just reading a script treatment, which is just kind of a text description of a movie, he could look at it and envision, how this is going to show up on the screen in a theater, at the end of the line. So, but that was something he grew into, for sure.
But I think my point is that he was known for, I wanted to share screen here. He was known for storyboarding, thinking through and storyboarding every shot, wasn't he, before he began filming?
Yeah. And that's so, yeah, absolutely. He was storyboarding his scenes. He became known for that. He wasn't the only person doing it, but he definitely promoted it, and promoted as the best way
these are
to make a movie.
Of sketches he
yeah.
These are examples
those are
of
from
sketches he drew.
Yeah, that's the bird attack from the Birds. And I don't believe he drove. I believe those were drawn by someone else.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, it's his vision for sure. And um, he at the when he was an art director and kind of coming up in the business, he spent a lot of time in Germany, and it was really the Germans who they were very methodical, as their culture is known for, at the way that they built their movies, and they were doing a lot of pre-planning and storyboarding, and he picked that up, from them most likely.
Okay. In terms of suspense, in our early dialogue about this, you had talked about the various forms of, you said, Hitchcockian suspense, right? And I was just wondering if you could just walk us through the major methods he used, the philosophies, the ideas, the strategies he used, the
Yeah.
techniques, right,
Yeah.
to create suspense in his films.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, so he told the story, and it's kind of a canard, it's a common story about what suspense is, the difference between suspense and surprise. So, surprise is you've got two people sitting at a table talking, and a bomb goes off, blows up, they're killed, we're shocked and surprised. Suspense is you got two people just sitting there talking at the same table, you got the same bomb under the table, but instead the camera cuts away and it shows the audience that bomb that's about to go off with the timer, counting down. And now the audience is engaged and they're saying, "Get away from that table. There's a bomb. You're gonna get killed." And so that's what suspense is, right? In other words, if we break that down, what that actually means is, and this is key, I believe, to Hitchcock's whole approach to cinema, what he called pure cinema. Maybe to back up a little bit, um, what makes a Hitchcock film a Hitchcock film more than others is this concept that he touted called pure cinema, and it's a term that he probably borrowed from the Spanish and French filmmaker John Epstein. But basically, pure cinema is what is it that's unique about film that you can do in cinema that you can't do in any other art form, and what can you do with it? And in his case, a movie, pure cinema, takes place entirely in the mind of the viewer. So we've got the bomb under the table, you've got the two people talking. We've got three parties to that conversation. We've got the characters, we've got the audience. But how is it that we know about the bomb? It's because the director told us about it. So the director is directly involved in that three-way conversation, right? And that's what makes a Hitchcock film is we're constantly engaging with him as the storyteller. He's the one giving us the information. And at the same time, the that story is playing out in our mind. It's not playing out literally, on that soundstage or anywhere else, right? We're completely in this ideal state.
Is there a distinction? I remember hearing, and it's a vague memory, but that Hitchcock talked about. I thought the terror or fear that the audience experiences can be generated more by the reaction of the character on the screen to what's happening, as opposed to focusing on the thing that's happening. Is that something that
that's tied to all this, because what's going on is, again, this terror that we're feeling is something it's inside our own head. It's not something that's literally happening on screen. And what he does is, he uses a subjective approach to filmmaking. In other words, he puts us inside the heads of the various characters. So in the case of Psycho and Marion Crane, we come to identify with her so implicitly that when that shower curtain is thrown open, it scares the hell out of us as well as her. And that's a good example of what you're describing, because we never see the knife enter the skin. We never see it plunge into her belly. That's all done with montage editing, but we do see her scream. And when we see her scream, we scream. We all scream.
and it reminds me of we're going to talk about the birds, but it reminds me
Yeah.
of, for example, the scene in the diner where the birds attack outside,
Yeah.
and they show that window where everyone's rushed to the window,
Yeah.
and Tippi Hedren's showing the shock, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's
That's
shocked, or the cook who comes out, and he's like, what happened, right?
yeah.
So it's the reaction of the characters is really impacting us more than the events in a way.
Yeah, that's and again, that's something that that's a pure cinema technique. It's all done through editing. So he described it as that he learned this from the Russians, the Kuleshov technique. Um because it was something that was sort of invented or discovered by Lev Kuleshov, uh, a Russian director in the 1930s, that we're not dependent. He did this to demonstrate that we are not dependent on an actor's acting ability in order to experience a movie or in order to experience emotions. And so the classic experiment was he had an actor look out the window and just look, and then he filmed the actor looking out the window, and now he's smiling. Got those two pieces of film. So between those two pieces of film, he inserted different scenes to show what the actor was looking at. And he showed a little baby in a baby carriage. Well, we turned to see the actor's reaction and he's smiling, then we assume that he's smiling, sort of paternally or with a kind of a familial sort of enjoyment. Well, then he takes that out and he puts a woman in a bathing suit in that interstitial piece of film. And now when we cut back to his reaction and he's smiling, well, now he's smiling lasciviously. We're interpreting it different ways. We're taking away a different belief when in fact it's the same piece of film of the actor smiling. And so that's a very deep insight into why film directors, have the power they have, but it's also a relational aspect that Hitchcock explored. And so, like in the scene that you're describing, we see all these reaction shots, and there's this moment when Tippi Hedren is looking out the window, and she's frozen. Her face is frozen. She's going, and then she's going, and that's totally his throwback to the Russians and Russian film theory. That's his tip of the hat to them.
I see. Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
I was wondering, can you break? Oh, we actually have a question, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
Someone in the audience asked, "Do they teach Hitchcock's methods in higher education?" So I assume like film school.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, he already studies Hitchcock in film school. Frankly, I think everybody should study Hitchcock in public school, just like they might study Shakespeare. Because I think people need to understand the grammar of film for the same reasons that they need to understand the grammar of written language. Especially now because people are watching motion, the moving image, far more than they're actually reading. Might be good to have some more literacy around that.
Yeah. I was wondering, do you, having your level of expertise, do you see when you look at his, the spectrum of the 52 films, I think you said, do you see them naturally breaking into like distinct stages? This phase, this phase, this phase.
Yeah, I think best way to describe it is, well, like I mentioned earlier, when he arrived on the scene, he was fully formed with his artistic vision. Like 19 years old, he was just like, he's like these paintings of the infant Jesus who looks like a little man. that was him psychologically or artistically. And so all we see for the next, 50 some years is just, we see that just come into more relief as time goes by. But I think the best way to look at these phases is through technological advancements. So he worked in silent. His first 9 films were silent. Then in 1929, he directed Britain's first sound film, which was also his last silent film. He made it twice. That was Blackmail. So we have pre-sound, post-sound. That's a dividing line in his career. Then we have the next period, which is, sound film. and up until the advent of color in 1948. And so that's another natural chalk line that we can snap. Then we get into the 50s, and then it's film stock changes. So um, this might be a little bit nerdy, but silver nitrate film came to an end in 1953. And after that, they started using safety film. And then a lot of nuance was lost when they started using this new film stock. We can see a subtle shift in his style there. But then we get into 50s and we start, because TV has come in, we see two things happening with him stylistically. One, he's doing these grand Vista Vision wraparound, films on the big screen that are so immersive. And at the very same time, he's moved into television, and he's started directing episodes for his Alfred Hitchcock Presents on a tiny squarish screen. And so he's kind of like working at both ends of the palette. So, and then I think the next big step is we get into the 60s and we see an end to the production code. And so he can have more freedom with displaying violence and sexuality. And that's his next phase. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So he could more explicitly, the production code limited.
Yeah. So from
violence
1935 and into the 60s, the production code, which was run by the American Catholic Church, had decided what was moral and what was not allowed on screen. He having been raised Catholic and Jesuit, he had feelings and opinions about his upbringing that he couldn't put on screen because the Catholic Church didn't allow priests, for example, to be villainous. But things like nudity and language and things like that.
Yeah. Something I want to share the screen again. Something we had discussed was the stylistic influence of contemporary artists, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a bit about that. Let me advance here. So I was wondering if you could just discuss a little bit. I've pulled some pictures here of like comparing like an Edward Hopper painting on the right to the School and the Birds, right? We talked about Hopper paintings compared to juxtaposed next, and it's the lighting, it's the sky, right, and also the perspective.
It's a lot of things. I'm fascinated. If you want to go back to that earlier picture of the house by the railroad. So I love that you put those two together, because the painting on the right is House by the Railroad. I just visited that house last summer, by the way.
Oh, did you? Wow.
Yeah, it's up in Dobbs Ferry or Haverstraw, New York, on the Hudson River, and Hopper country. Like, you drive through these neighborhoods and you're basically driving through a Hopper painting constantly. But anyway, that painting, House by the Railroad, it is claimed that was the inspiration for the Bates Mansion in Psycho. And I love that you paired it with a very similar building, the schoolhouse from the Birds, of course. And there are a couple of things, like, yes, you've got similarities in architecture and perspective and such, but going in, we can go in at a level below that, because the mood and the feeling, the vibe, the themes of these paintings are, I believe, what Hitchcock, is really grabbing onto. So, for example, that why that is so evocative of the Bates Mansion is that, if we want to just come back to that so people can see, it's on the wrong side of the tracks. It's on the other side of the tracks, right? And just like the Bates Mansion is on the wrong side of the highway where they moved the highway. The house is a little bit run down. It's forlorn. It's very tall and narrow, so it's kind of cramped. It sort of is standing cramped, just like we see Norman Bates lives a very cramped, constricted existence in his house. So it's very evocative of the character Norman Bates, who is sort of synonymous with the mansion that he lives in. So this is what, to me, gives these comparisons so much power.
So
We don't know for
so
sure that it was the inspiration behind the Bates mansion.
yeah, I had noticed the similar I had noticed this similarity probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I had forgotten when I gathered these photos that it also
Yeah.
looked like the Bates Mansion. But
Yeah.
I want to show a few more here. So
Ah, beautiful.
this bottom left here is a scene from The Birds, and
Yeah,
it's evocative of an Andrew Wyeth landscape, right, with the distant
absolutely.
rising horizon, the pale, almost monochromatic colors.
Yes.
And I mentioned this one to you in email, and you
Yeah.
had never heard this one before, but
Yeah.
a lot of the characters in The Birds reminded me of Norman Rockwell paintings.
Yeah,
I didn't bring up a Rockwell painting, but there were so many of the characters, like the man who
absolutely.
runs the store in
Yeah.
Bodega Bay, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then I didn't even know about this. I'm assuming you know about this, but Salvador Dali designed a dream sequence for him in an early film.
Yeah, this is for Spellbound, 1945. And it's lovely. Like you mentioned, Gregory Peck has these dreams that through this wackadoodle Freudian psychoanalysis, if they can decipher the dream, then they can find out who the real killer is and exonerate Gregory Peck, who's on the run. It's a cockamamie story, but the idea of going into a dream analysis and using that to solve a crime was a fun Hollywood device. And it was the first time that Freud had come to Hollywood, the movies, and um, it was Salvador Dali's first visit to Hollywood as well. And the design and the sets are absolutely spectacular. Yeah.
Uh, and you had mentioned you had brought this photo. I was wondering if you could tell us about this and its relation to Hitchcock.
Yeah, so this is a painting, um, a print of which has adorned the walls of, I don't know, 15% of children around the Western world. It's called Twittering Machine, and it's by an artist named Paul Klee, who is one of the greats of the 20th century, taught at the Bauhaus, all kinds of things. Um, and he was also Hitchcock's favorite artist. He loved his work. He owned four of his works. He didn't own this, but the what what is fascinating about this picture is the longer you look at it, the more it seems to change and evolve and morph. For most people, when they first look at it, it looks rather whimsical with those little curly cues and those snappy little beaks. But the more you look at it, the creepier it gets. And so it's almost like running a movie before your very eyes. It changes, and that changeable quality is sort of evoked in the color wash in the background. Um, it's actually not a painting. It's a sort of a print technique, not unlike doing like a carbon copy. But uh, Hitch, I believe, was drawn to him because of this notion of humor and whimsy blending so seamlessly and perfectly with the macabre, and that's what his movies are all about. And so if there's one piece of art out there that is you could say is sort of a manifesto work of that would sum up Hitchcock, this might come the closest. You can imagine looking at this picture, cranking that little crank, and what kind of music would you hear? Maybe it would sound like the funeral march of the marionettes from Alfred Hitchcock Presents, right? The
Huh.
theme song. So so to understand Hitchcock, who extolled his virtues all the time, he said, "I wish Klee had been my storyboard artist. He would have made great storyboards."
Wow.
He held a lot of affinity. Like I said, he owned four of his works himself. His first major art acquisition, and he owned a museum worth of art in his house. His first big acquisition was a Klee in 1937.
And I recall oh, I thought I had another yeah, in North by Northwest, apparently he wanted this house to be designed based upon a Frank Lloyd Wright
Yeah,
home. Yeah. So
yeah. They
I'd like to
did. Oh,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh,
No, go
they
ahead.
yeah they'd reached out to Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house. They knew it would be just a model, and they got the estimate back and said, "No, we can do it ourselves."
Oh, that's funny.
People
What?
believe this exists, and it only exists on paper, on film.
Wow. Well, I'd like to shift to we had said we'd discuss North by Northwest and the birds. I'd like to start talking about North by Northwest. Um, I was just wondering, that film, if you could just, give us the synopsis or the overview, and then I'm wondering what to you, what strikes you about this film that makes it uniquely Hitchcock? What are the hallmarks of this film that are Hitchcock's approach with North by Northwest?
So I think a great way to maybe answer that quickly is he and his screenwriter sat down at Ernest Lehman and said, Ernest Lehman said, "I want to create the Hitchcock film to end all Hitchcocks, where you just throw the kitchen sink of Hitchcock ideas and tropes on the screen and let's just have fun with it." And so it's unusual in that it's one of the few Hitchcock movies that's not based on a previously existing work. It was built from scratch, and I think this is a really good example of how he worked always. That he always started with something small, and then he built up from there. So, like in Notorious, you have a key that goes to a door, and suddenly everything depends on that key. In this case, he started out with a germ of an idea. He just liked the idea of having a climactic chase across the faces of Mount Rushmore. And then his challenge to the writer was, okay, how do we get there? And then later on, somebody said, well, we can work into this United Nations scene. So, oh, now we've got a scene. Okay. But then finally, somebody else wrote in an idea and said, I've got an idea. How about if we create a non-existent spy to use as a decoy that all of the bad guys are chasing? And now they've got a driving force. And with those three tiny pieces, they worked the script together. So basically, it's about a guy who, Roger Thornhill, played by Cary Grant. He's an ad executive. He is mistaken for this non-existent spy. And now he's got to go on the run and prove to the bad guys that he's not who they're after. He's got to prove to the cops who are also after him that he's not this non-existent character. And so we have he's in an existential crisis because he's being mistaken for nobody. And it's Cary Grant. So the ironies and the humor are just kind of like built right in there.
And I mentioned to you, I had seen a brief documentary on YouTube about the making of North by Northwest. And it was fascinating to hear them talk about how you mentioned the story evolved, but it was built around, from what I heard in this documentary, these iconic images. So what was fascinating is that Hitchcock just had these images in his mind that stuck with him. It seemed like the way they talked about it, like for years.
Yeah.
And then he just like adds these images, like the scene at the UN, this scene with the biplane, right?
Mm-hmm.
The face of Mount Rushmore. And these are cinematic, dynamic images, and he's like incorporating them and helping to structure a story around them. They stay with him, and then he synthesizes them. Is that how he's always worked, or was North by Northwest unique in that way?
No, that's exactly how his mind worked. And it's a very ancient technique. So this goes back to Aristotle, but pre-Greek, really. But for example, this idea of a chase across the faces of a monumental, statue like this, he first did that in 1929 in Blackmail, when part of the chase goes through the British Museum, and you see this guy climbing a rope down across these faces of these giant Egyptian statues. And so what he did was he would get fixated on a certain kind of thing or a certain cinematic idea, and then he would do it again and again and again. And each time he iterated on it, it became more and more rich, became more nuanced. And so, like, by the time we get to North by Northwest, not only do we have the spectacle of the surreal spectacle of these people running across these faces, but we also have all kinds of commentary about the you can read as much as you want into it. The temporariness of life, the permanence of fame, the politics behind it, the fraught politics behind the building of the monument itself is also in there. And and so what we see is kind of his ruminations, building up layer after layer. Each time we see this motif, this favorite motif of his.
What do you feel that this film achieved? What was it, Lehman you mentioned?
Yeah, Ernest Lehman.
Do you think it achieved that goal of creating the Hitchcock film to end all Hitchcock films? Do you view it this way?
Well, he came out with half dozen more after that, so it didn't end them. And I think it was a hard one to top for sure. But then he topped it with Psycho the very next year, right? And then he topped that with The Birds 3 years after that. So
you feel the Birds topped? You feel the Birds topped North by Northwest?
Well, I think. Well, I mean, these are relative terms, so I don't want to invest too much in that kind of comparison. But I think one way to think about it is that at the end of the day, North by Northwest is about one guy dealing with these sort of untouchable forces around him. He's being mistaken for a non-existent person. How would you feel? And it's one thing to have a doppelganger. It's another thing to have a doppelganger that doesn't exist. That's freaky. But then you have Psycho, which is personal in another way. But then The Birds is an apocalypse movie, right? And so we can kind of see like it. Here's kind of how I think a great way to put it in context. North by Northwest, the whole film is kind of a recycling of big ideas that starts with the 39 steps, right? Basically the 39 steps all over again. And which gets retold as Saboteur, Foreign Correspondent, North by Northwest, and then later on in Topaz in 1969. Okay, so without North by Northwest, James Bond was literally an attempt to kind of capitalize on or draft on the success of North by Northwest. If there'd been North by Northwest, there might have not have been a James Bond. Without James Bond, we wouldn't have Jason Bourne and Mission Impossible.
Right.
So then we move on to Psycho. Without Psycho, we wouldn't have all the slasher films of the 60s and 70s. Without The Birds, we might not have all the apocalyptic disaster films that came in after that. So he was creating whole genres.
Well, I wanted to ask you about The Birds too. The Birds, I would say, is for me personally one of my favorite films, and but it's iconic, and I actually had the chance to see it in the theater too. That was an amazing experience. But I was wondering, could you do the same thing with this film? Character, what's the give us an overview of the plot and define for you what's the essence of this film. What did it accomplish, and how is it viewed in his body of work?
Funnily enough, it wasn't that successful when it came out. It was very successful on TV, and actually based on its TV popularity, it's kind of grown in popularity overall. But it's essential Hitchcock in the sense that, for a lot of reasons. One of them is he has constantly in his films delving into fear and what it means to be afraid and what makes us afraid. And with The Birds, of course, we have this sort of ultimate birds are everywhere. And if they turn on us, what could happen? Oh, this could happen. That's a scary thought, right? But it gets at some very existential matters. I think maybe one telling thing about it is early drafts of the screenplay with Evan Hunter included all kinds of references to the Cold War. And so the idea that it could be allegorical of nuclear war is not far from the story of the movie. But then they strip all that out. We get a little radio blip at one point. We hear a radio announcer talking about JFK, but by taking out the allegory, now the symbol of the birds becomes abstracted into any fear you want. So it could be a fear of female sexuality. That's a great, male fear of female sexuality. That's I've got a whole case loads of books about that. Uh, Global thermonuclear war. Sure, why not? How about just our fear of death itself and just the fact that we're all gonna die, one way or the other. So, plus, without the birds and the technology that went into the special effects, that definitely laid the groundwork for Star Wars.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
One thing we discussed, I told you that I had noticed that in the birds that they just repeat over and over again. It's this psychological experience of people sheltering together in a space inside, right? Yeah. And forming a bond, an emotional bond, because they're helping each other and trying to protect each other from this external threat. And you related that to an experience that Hitchcock had. I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Oh yeah. So I think part of what makes Hitchcock is he survived the firebombing of London in World War I when he was a teenager, just an impressionable, sensitive young man. And he would have been like 14, 15 years old. And the surviving that war, they would wake up daily wondering if their house was going to be bombed to matchsticks. But they still had to break for tea because they were Londoners. And so they're breaking for tea while the dishes around them are just like, hopping around like, jumping beans. Right. And, um, and so it was kind of funny. It was terrifying. And so this combination of delight and terror, is just right there in those experiences. So anyway, we get to the birds, and, that feeling of being surrounded by death, and it could come from anywhere from the sky at any time, is what what they experience in there. In fact, when when he was shooting these scenes and he wanted the family to be running around the room in terror, not knowing which direction to run in, he had a timpanist off camera banging on a timpani, on a kettle drum, to simulate the sound of bombs dropping. So he was kind of, in his mind, he was sort of recreating the terror that he felt 50 years earlier.
Oh, and two more questions about this film, and then we're getting close to ending this. Hours gone by. But
wow.
But I noticed in the film very distinct diction. So the Annie Hayworth and Tippi Hedren's character, Melanie Daniels, they're constantly saying yes, yes, and even I think Rod Taylor says it. And then I noticed Eva Marie Saint sort of says yes a lot. It's just one word, one line, and they pronounce it in a certain way. And I was wondering, maybe it's my imagination, right? Maybe I'm reading into it, and maybe I'm drawing connections when they don't exist. But I was wondering, did he direct the actors at that minute, granular level of like diction and pronunciation of words?
He could have. I mean, in general, he gave his actors a free hand, let them do whatever they wanted as long as they stayed inside the camera sight lines. But he would, because his attitude was they're professionals, they can figure it out. So he gave them that space. But there were times when he would really micromanage things, for a certain effect. And it's interesting you picked up on that because so many lines in his films were written in by him, and they are clues to how he himself works. So in Rope, 1948, one of the characters says, Rupert, the James Stewart character, sometimes chooses words for their sound rather than their meaning. And that's Hitchcock describing his work. And so that yes thing is, I don't know why that happened, but sure, it's absolutely conceivable that he would have given them that line reading. And because he wanted that sound, less than the meaning of the word yes.
And it just in close with the birds, I was just wondering, how do you view the legacy of the birds? How do you view it in the history of film? Is it considered, for example, like I thought North by Northwest was often considered like one of the top 100 films of the 20th century, right? does the birds stand that high in the history of
Yeah.
film as an accomplishment in film?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is absolutely mined for its richness. I think one thing that proves that it stands the test of time is that people can watch it and not only get entertained and get all the scares and thrills and sexy fun out of it, but the themes that it's putting out there, complacency in the face of a very fragile society is what the movie is about. And don't you know, we're here now with that in 2024. We're living with complacency and dealing with the conflict between that and the natural human desire for normalcy.
Wow. Well, Joel, unfortunately, the hour's come to an end, so we have
We're
to
done.
stop.
That's
But
it.
it didn't seem like an hour to me, but
Yeah,
it really was fascinating, and I wish we could go on for another hour. I really do
absolutely. Time
appreciate it.
flies.
It was a real pleasure. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay. Um, and I would like to close, as we often do at Empower You, with just a remembrance on this day in history. It was February 27th, 1922. The Supreme Court unanimously affirmed that the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote was constitutional. And I wanted to mention, I had actually looked into the history of the women's movement. I studied it a few years ago. And you might know that the movement kind of began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. And at that time, Frederick Douglass was actually at that convention, and he spoke up and said he supported, women having the right to vote, and essentially the African American community and women started to collaborate over the next 20 years or so to try to get the right to vote. And eventually, Frederick Douglass realized after the Civil War was over that they probably couldn't get a single amendment passed that gave both groups the right to vote. So he broke off from the women's movement and started to pursue the right to vote just for African American men. And of course, they eventually got that right to vote in 1870, but it would be another 50 years before the women we passed the 19th Amendment and women had the right to vote. So that's it. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Joel. There's one more question I want to see if it's okay. That's it. And I want to thank you and go out and empower you.